What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you a video about Vampire the Masquerade Swansong, which is a narrative RPG set in, of course, the Vampire the Masquerade setting that released yesterday from the time of this video, or May 19th. That said, with this particular video, there's really two subjects that I want to talk about. The game itself, of course, and what frankly I think is a higher than average barrier to entry for a game like this. So let's get the part out of the way first that I just haven't seen anybody talking about, and that is the fact that this is a narrative RPG that is an Epic Game Store exclusive being sold for $50 that comes with 2 bits of DLC that are sold separately for, I think it's $7 each. Now, if you're unaware, $50 for a narrative RPG is a lot. That said, this particular game is a third-person narrative RPG. It's a little more graphically impressive than these games tend to be. However, to be clear, Swansong isn't that amazing looking either. But in addition to the $50 base game price, we have the 2 DLCs, and one of those DLCs gives you an extra quest given to you by a popular character from a TTRPG thing that happened on, I believe it was Twitch, called LA by Night. A character from that series, if you will, is supposed to give you a quest in-game. And then the other one gives you a bunch of items that will help you out along your way, which for a narrative RPG is kind of weird. And while DLC is hardly anything new or anything like that, I will say what you're getting for those 2 DLCs seems exceptionally small. But more importantly, the base game is $50. For a narrative RPG, that is a big hill to climb. Combine that with the fact that this is an Epic Game Store exclusive, and I think, to reiterate, that you've given a game a high barrier of entry for most people, because that high price for the genre, combined with the Epic Game Store launcher, which a lot of people just don't like to use because it's Epic's, and while I've been a critic of it myself, obviously I bought the game because I make content for a living, and of course I'm going to. Now, in fairness to the game, there is a sale going on right now with the Epic Game Store specifically, where you can get 25% off of the game, which actually brings it down to $35. And if that was the base price, I'd be totally fine with it. Frankly, I just felt that I needed to lead with that because I hadn't really seen it mentioned anywhere else, and it struck me as very strange nobody was talking about that information. But from there, let's actually jump into the title itself and talk about it a little bit. We see ourselves playing as one of 3 vampires who are pretty well established in their court, if you will, that is set in the city of Boston. The nature of the narrative being told to us in this narrative RPG is that of a mystery. There is an attack on your sect, the Camarilla, at a very crucial point in their planning for the future, and naturally you have to investigate that, and you are given the role of one of the 3 vampires. You play as all 3 of them, so you don't pick one, but rather you play as all 3 as the narrative suits it, and you'll use their associated disciplines, powers, and skills, etc. to basically unravel this mystery, get information together, and as you might imagine, there's a bunch of branching narrative paths that can, of course, change the outcome. And overall, I think the game does do that pretty well. If you're familiar with Vampire the Masquerade, pretty much everything from the more recent entries in that particular TTRPG are here. Things like Blood Resonance from the V5 stuff. You get to use your disciplines, influence conversations, sneak about, investigate this mystery, learn information, all in a way that has choices and consequence presented to you. And as someone who is a really big fan of narrative RPGs, that is what I'm looking for, so it's nice to see. I will say, in terms of the more recent V5 Vampire the Masquerade, I have yet to encounter any of the La Sombra clan in this particular game. The La Sombra clan, or at least a good portion of it, in the more modern versions of the game, went from the Sabbat, which is a sect of vampires, to the Camarilla, which is a sect of vampires that uphold the Masquerade, which of course gives the setting its name. Now, I'm hoping they get pulled into it later. I'm still relatively early in game, so hopefully they'll be in there, but other than that, pretty much all the more modern stuff is there. And I will say, probably the most important thing for a narrative RPG is that so far the story is pretty compelling, and the characters are relatively interesting. As you go through the various situations you find yourself and you're exploring, etc., when you're using your skills and your powers and you use them successfully, this will result in experience towards the end of the scene that then you can, upon entering the next scene, spend to upgrade your skills and vampire disciplines, etc., which will make that vampire better at what they do, and you do this for all 3 of the vampires. When you actually start playing as them, though, you do get the opportunity to choose between a few different types of presets, if you will, that will kind of specialize for you. So if you're not really sure about how to build a character because you haven't played a game like this before, then they do have some presets available to you. And from perusing them a little bit, they do seem pretty good, meaning that the description does actually kind of match what that thing is supposed to be doing. However, if you want to choose to customize your vampire's abilities, etc. by yourself, they do have a free option that will allow you to do that as well, which I thought was the right move for sure. But at the end of the day, these are 3 vampires who are quite established with a pretty dedicated character background. So while you can change what they're good at a little bit, the character's personality just kind of is what it is. So you're not going to be able to change them in that regard. Beyond that though, when you're using your skills in dialogue, usually you have to match the person you're talking to's ability of the same type. So if you're using rhetoric or dialogue, you have to have a skill level for that is higher than your opponent's, and you can use a resource called willpower to actually give yourself some extra points. And if it's a tie, if you both have the same level, there's actually just a % chance because the game calls it an uncertain outcome, and it will actually show a little dice roll where it's deciding. And there are a few factors that influence the success rates of that, if you will, which overall I actually liked the feel of. My description might not actually be doing it justice, but when you're playing the game, it does kind of feel like you have this battle of personalities between these vampires, which I thought was pretty cool. But ultimately, that's the core of the game. It's a narrative RPG, so there's really not a lot to explain because the game is telling you a story where you'll be presented with choices, options, and depending on the character you've built, etc., you'll go through that story and there's a bunch of branching narratives. So the main takeaway for me from the first impressions of this game are 1, that the price is quite high at $50. I'm not necessarily saying that that makes it an instant no buy, because ultimately I think that boils down to the quality of the story being told. And while it is fairly compelling right now, I would tell you that one of my favorite narrative RPGs, or one of my favorite stories in gaming at least, of Planescape Torment, has an amazing story, and I wouldn't have paid $50 for it when it released. But again, in fairness, you can actually get this game for 25% off right now through the Epic Games Store launcher, which I think is about the only fair way you're going to get a decent price on this game right at this moment. Because as I go through and move to review this title, unless the story is just absolutely mind-blowing, I doubt it's going to be able to change my mind on that $50 price point. But we will see, and I like to be an optimist, so I'm hoping the game manages to do so. So with all of that said, guys, there you go. There's my first impressions of Vampire the Masquerade Swansong. Hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you did, please remember to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, thank you, may you wander in wisdom, and have an amazing day.